Okay, so let me introduce Vanessa Dornish, who is our speaker for tonight. She is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve. So that's headquartered in Tuckerton, New Jersey. That's our local National Estuarine Research Reserve. And she'll be speaking about 10 ways to adapt to coastal flooding. So just quickly, Vanessa has work experience as well as personal experience on the coast, particularly of New Jersey, both New Jersey and Florida. She does have a master's degree from the University of Florida in ecology and a bachelor's from Rowan University in environmental studies and geography. And does have work experience, again, both in New Jersey and in Florida, working as an environmental specialist dealing with coastal resilience planning, as well as other positions doing public outreach concerning beach and urban resilience, and public education on coastal construction and dune restoration, just to give you a few highlights of that. So with that being said, if there's no other notes I've forgotten about, I will turn it over to Vanessa.
Sounds good.
Just give me a second. Okay, you should be in control now.
Okay. All right, all good. You can see it?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. So good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. As Sal said, I work at the Jacques Cousteau National Estuarine Research Reserve in Tuckerton. And one of the big focuses of the work I do is building resilience to coastal flooding. So that's what I'll be talking about tonight. A lot of times when people have questions about flood risk, they follow a common theme. People want to know, will I be impacted? If I'm going to be impacted, how bad will it be? If I'm going to be impacted, what can I do about it? And what is the government doing about it? And the answers to all those questions depend on where you live. So I can't give you individual answers to that tonight, but what I'm going to do instead is show you the tools and resources you can use to find the answers for yourself. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll know how to go forth and find out about your own flood risk and some of the things you can do about it. As I cover different tools, I have website links on the screen, and I'll point those out to you, and then I assume I'll also be able to share the PowerPoint afterwards if you miss any. As Sal said, please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. I have a couple natural breakpoints where I'll stop and see if there's any questions before we move on to a completely new topic and get too far away from whatever you were asking about. So before I get into the meat and potatoes of tonight, I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about where I work. The Jacques Cousteau Reserve is a mouthful to say, so we usually just call it the JC NEAR. It's part of a national network of 29 coastal reserves that are managed by NOAA and a state partner in the state that it's in. Usually the state partner is a regulatory agency or a university, and in the case of the JC NEAR, that's Rutgers University. And the purpose of this reserve system is to manage estuaries through kind of a three-pronged approach of scientific research, education and training, and stewardship. And so tonight, I'm aiming at that education and training piece as part of our reserve's mission. It's called the Estuarine Research Reserve System because all of the reserves are located around estuaries. An estuary is just a body of water and wetlands that are found where rivers meet the ocean. So in the case of the JC NEAR, it's where the Mullica River meets the Great Bay and then eventually flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. The reserve itself is over 116 acres, and all of the land is under some form of public management, be it federal or state management. And it's a lot more than an estuary. We have areas of forest, there's the river itself, the bay, of course, we have an inlet system, and also actually a sandy beach barrier island. So there's a lot of different ecosystems within the reserve. The area that Rutgers manages is actually quite small. It's in Tuckerton along Great Bay Boulevard here in yellow. And that's where we have the Coastal Education Center, where I work, and also the Rutgers Marine Field Station. From Tuckerton, we carry out those three goals of the reserve: research, education, and stewardship. The research arm is done at the Rutgers Marine Field Station, which is on the bottom right here. We also have education programs for teachers and families, and an exhibit at the Tuckerton Seaport. Although the facilities at Tuckerton right now are closed to the public, we have shifted a lot of our educational programming online. And so I encourage you to go to our website. It's at the top right, jcnear.org, to learn more about what we do and get involved with some of our programs. And even though our facilities are closed, we do have a trail at the Coastal Education Center. The entrance to it is pictured at the top right, and it's a nice interpretive trail through the woods, and it has a boardwalk out over a little marsh, and that's what's on the top left. So the coastal training program is that training arm of the reserve's mission, and that is where I am the lead. The goal of the coastal training program is to provide science and information to coastal decision makers. And by coastal decision makers, that could be government officials, it could be businesses, or it could just be coastal residents. Basically, anyone who has a stake in coastal decisions. And, obviously government members make decisions that can have really big impacts, but residents can too. And so a major focus of the JCNEAR's coastal training program is building resilience to coastal hazards like storms and flooding and sea level rise. And this idea of resilience is something that has become a focus of many groups across the region, especially since Hurricane Sandy. This is a picture of Sandy on October 28th when it was about 600 miles south of NYC. It's a NASA satellite image. I just thought that was cool. So enough about me. Let's get into what we came here to talk about. A major part of this coastal resilience specifically is adapting to flooding, which we're here to talk about tonight. Before we start talking about it, though, I think it's important that we set the context for the word resilience for what we are talking about. A lot of times in an ecological context, when we're talking about the environment, we think about resilience as bouncing back from a disruption. If there's some sort of natural disaster, an event, eventually the ecosystem gets back to normal within a set amount of time. But in the context of preparing our communities for flooding and storms, we really like to think of resilience as bouncing forward. And what I mean by that is through preparing, taking actions to be ready, and to adapt to flooding, you can actually be better off after a flood event through those actions. There's a ton of different aspects that go into resilience planning and coastal adaptation. And because of that, we kind of like to think of resilience as a puzzle with all these different pieces. We have to be aware of our changing environment, and then we need science to inform what we're going to do about those changes. The scientific data that we have is used to develop resilience planning tools, some of the ones I'm going to show you tonight. And then we also have to consider that New Jersey has a really diverse coastline. Both environmentally, we have bays and rivers, we have the ocean, obviously, and also the way our coastline is developed differs a whole lot depending on where you are. We have very industrialized areas and we have mostly natural areas. And so adapting to flooding looks very different depending on what sort of environment you're in. Because of all these different aspects that go into resilience planning, there's a lot of decision points. And these include things like your time frames for taking action. When you do take action, how long you expect that project to work to help with flooding, and also what types of actions to take. There's lots of different ways to adapt to flooding, whether it's land use changes or infrastructure updates. And so all these things require lots of partners across the state to make sure that all voices are being heard, both across the state and within communities. Sometimes the loudest voices are not necessarily representative of what everyone in the community needs to adapt to flooding. And so all of these pieces of the puzzle feed into what we're here to talk about tonight, which is what the government is doing and what you can do as a resident. And so before I jump into those actions, I think this is a good spot to just see if anybody has put any questions in the chat.
Hi, sorry, it's Sal. I was muted. No, I don't see any.
Okay.
At this point.
Excellent. Thanks. All right, so we'll keep going. So let's jump into it. I'm going to cover some of what the government is doing at all different levels throughout the state, and then we'll wrap up with the 10 things you can do. So starting at the federal level, one of the major players is the Army Corps of Engineers. One of the things they do that you probably have heard of before are beach nourishment projects. This is a photo of a nourished beach in Harvey, Cedars on LBI after a nor'easter storm in 2017. So these are projects where they put sand on the beach and they build a big dune, and it serves two purposes. One, it's nice to have a recreational beach to use, but in a way, its true purpose is actually to protect development from storm impacts. So you can see here in this picture, the storm has eaten away at that dune pretty well, but you can imagine what the houses would look like if the dune wasn't there. And this is not an unusual thing to see after our winter storms in New Jersey. So the Army Corps eventually will come back in and repair this to build back up that protective dune. And most federal efforts are not just purely federal. Usually there is a cost sharing from the state government and also usually some from the local government. In the case of Army Corps projects, usually they're cost shared with the New Jersey DEP, which actually has a dedicated fund that puts $25 million each year towards these large protective projects. The Army Corps does more than beach nourishment, though. They also do other types of major flood control infrastructure. This is a picture of a floodgate in Port Monmouth, which is in Middletown Township along the Raritan Bay. So the way this thing works is it has gates that come down. In the picture on the left-hand side right now, the gates are down. When the gates are up, they're hoisted up on those rope things you can see coming down, and they would be more where you can see the clouds right now. So the way this works is if a storm surge comes in this little river, they put down the gates and it stops the water from impacting the neighborhoods that are behind the floodgate. This is part of a much bigger system of infrastructure in this area to protect these towns along Raritan Bay. There's many miles of levees and berms, and also beach and dune nourishment along the bay's shoreline itself. So moving on to another major federal actor on the flood adaptation scene, FEMA. Many of you have probably heard of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And their specialization is really storm preparedness and recovery. And I should give the disclaimer that all of these agencies are involved in a whole suite of research and infrastructure funding and communication. So when I say that FEMA does storm preparedness and recovery, I don't mean that's the only thing they do, but I'm just giving you kind of a taste tonight of some of the major stuff these groups do. So one mechanism for resilience planning with FEMA is the hazard mitigation plan. Hazard mitigation plans are required by FEMA. They have to be approved the state creates it, and it's approved by FEMA, and it's required in order to get funding if there's a storm and there's disaster assistance, or if they have some proactive funding for what they call mitigation projects, which are to prepare structures and areas for flooding before an event, with the purpose of lessening the impact when an event does come. And so the New Jersey Hazard Mitigation Plan is administered by the State Office of Emergency Management. There's also a county level hazard mitigation plan for each of New Jersey's counties that's developed with input from the municipalities. So overall, what these plans do is they capture historic disaster experiences, and they then identify current hazards based on the best available science. After identifying the hazards, they lay forth a strategy to reduce risks from those hazards, and that strategy is a basis for prioritizing future project funding. So if you're interested in what the State Hazard Mitigation Plan says, you can find it at that link in the top right. ready.nj.gov is the OEM website, and you'll find the plan there. If you're interested in what your county hazard mitigation plan has in it, if you just do a search for the name of your county and the phrase hazard mitigation plan, they're usually pretty easy to find. They come right up on the Google search. And those county plans will also have a list of projects for your municipality, which can be kind of cool to look at. So the point of this hazard mitigation planning is that it allows us to take that bounce forward that I mentioned before. Things like elevating structures and raising roadways or raising bulkheads, stabilizing shorelines. Doing that in advance of a storm means that when the storm comes, there will be theoretically less of an impact. And a lot of times what we're talking about is monetary impact, structural damage. One shortcoming of the way this is done is that it requires a benefit cost analysis, meaning that the benefits, which are avoided costs from a storm, need to be more than the cost of the project itself. And, on paper, that's a really sound way of making decisions. You want projects to be cost effective. But one trouble that it has in practice is that it doesn't account necessarily for the environmental or social benefits of doing a project. So, for example, living shorelines like this project on the left, where you have rock wall and then vegetation planted behind it, may not compete well on a benefit cost analysis, say with a regular bulkhead, because the benefit cost analysis doesn't account for the environmental benefits of creating habitat through those plantings. The good news is that FEMA has now started to allow environmental benefits to be incorporated into their benefits cost analysis. And I also believe that the Army Corps is working on updating their criteria so we can see more diverse projects that are really accounting for all benefits, not just damage reduction to buildings. So the third federal player that I'm going to talk about tonight is NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. That one's a mouthful. And NOAA is really the leader in resilience planning, research, and communications. They give a lot of the funding for the resilience work that the New Jersey Coastal Management Program does, a lot of the work that my reserve does around resilience. And they also do a lot of great communications work themselves. So this graphic here is used to explain why it's good to do mitigation projects prior to a storm. It kind of gets at that benefit cost analysis idea that I was just talking about. Basically, by investing $1 proactively in mitigation, you can save about $6 in future storm damage costs. And so really, like with most things, being proactive is the way to go. At the state level, the state is working on a coastal resilience plan. Basically, this is going to be a plan to guide the state level policies and regulation and funding as we move forward into a future with expecting to have more flooding in more areas. We have a really expansive coastal zone in New Jersey. It's about 1,800 miles of shoreline from the New York border way up in the Northeast and down all the way up to the head of tide in the Delaware River. That area right by Trenton is actually where the Delaware River stops being tidal. So many people don't realize that, but we consider this entire area in green, blue, teal color to be coastal in New Jersey. It's about 3,200 square miles and 239 municipalities, and over half the population. So we are definitely a coastal state, and it's important that we put state level resources into planning for impacts to the coast. The Coastal Resilience Plan is actually part of a broader climate change resilience strategy that the state is working on, and this strategy will address things that go beyond coastal impacts. It'll address the broader impacts of climate change like rainfall, wildfire, changing temperatures, things that affect the entire state, not just the coast. And this just shows the 6 focus areas of the strategy. With all of these things going on in the state, there are a ton of different partners working to build resilience, both at the state level and locally. This slide is by no means a list of all the groups working on resilience, but it's a list of the ones we work with often at JC Near. And of course, there's also a lot of regional and local partners that are on this slide. So one of the things JC Near has done in partnership with some of these partners, specifically for the Getting to Resilience program, it was done with DEP and the Coastal Management Program, and it's a tool that local governments can use to self-assess their resilience. They basically take a self-assessment survey online. It's done collaboratively with different groups from the municipality, planning folks, engineering folks, public works, and it helps them to identify their strengths, needs, and opportunities for resilience. Since Sandy, JC Near has worked with over 60 municipalities to complete this process. But of course, there are other planning pathways towards resilience besides this one. Overall, the benefit of planning at the municipal level is that it allows communities to be better prepared for disasters and to recover more quickly. Just by having a plan of what you're going to do in the hours and days and months after a natural disaster, make it go a lot more smoothly and allow for quicker recovery. Planning is also the first step towards actually starting to implement resilience projects and taking action. And many towns have now moved on to the point where they're implementing engineering measures that either keep the water out or move the water away from development. This picture on the left is a roadway drainage project in Ocean City. And they're also implementing land use and regulatory changes that can effectively make development that's within flood-prone areas less vulnerable, less likely to be damaged, and also can just shift development away from these vulnerable areas so that when the water does come, there aren't buildings to be messed up. Often you can find steps about what your municipality is doing on their website. And now I'm going to move into the things residents can do, but I'm going to ask Sal again if there's any questions here before we move on.
Yeah, so we've gotten a couple questions about these kind of projects. One thing that's kind of specific is they're wondering if there was an update on the Army Corps Back Bay study. So that's what
Yeah, I'm not the person to know the answer to that question.
Okay.
The Army Corps Back Bay study was not funded for this fiscal year. That's why it's kind of been put on pause. So I would say there probably isn't an update until they come out with next year's fiscal work plan and they see if they get more money to keep going.
Okay. I did happen to look it up quickly, and there was an interim report from 2019, so I'll add that link to the chat.
Thank you. Perfect.
People who are interested. Give me a second to kind of parse through this.
Okay.
So thinking about beach nourishment projects, if you put houses behind the dunes and there's going to be dune erosion, Does this make sense? Are you basically just pushing the beach erosion further down the shoreline when you do this?
So the houses behind the dune are not necessarily changing erosion down the shoreline. If there were no houses at all and we let the beach do as it would move around. Sometimes those houses would be in the water. Maybe 20 years later, there'd be a beach there again. It would be a very dynamic system. But what I will say is that obviously, having a house right behind a dune, the dune is offering protection, but it's not permanent protection. It can be washed away. And I think the DEP has begun to recognize that some of their rules at least need to be looked at in the face of severe storms, climate change, sea level rise. And I think they've begun to consider potential rule changes that would have a little bit more regulation for what happens in the area right behind the dune. But I will, later in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the state's doing and how you can find out more about that as far as regulatory change. So I'll hold off. I'll leave that there for now.
Okay, that sounds good. Here's a question. Why hasn't there been a movement to include living shorelines and hybrid shorelines in the quote engineering category?
Well, I don't know what exactly we mean by the engineering category. Something that a lot of groups, JC Near, the Nature Conservancy, even some folks within the Army Corps, folks at the state have been working on for the past several years is to support and incentivize the use of more living shorelines. I don't know if that answers the question. The difference is that although a living shoreline certainly offers protection, a lot of it is we haven't had them in place long enough to know exactly how high, let me back up for a second. If you have a bulkhead, we can say this bulkhead is this height. We know that if storm surge comes to this height, the bulkhead will be keeping the water out, right? That's not quite how living shorelines work. They're not as exact of a science, but the science is improving. And one of the things that people have been doing is working to get more monitoring of living shorelines so that we can have that data to say, this is exactly how you design a living shoreline to protect against X feet of storm surge. And once we have better data like that, I think you will see that they will be considered engineering.
Okay, I think that's the bulk of the questions for now.
Okay. All right, great. So we've covered kind of in a quick nutshell a little bit of what the government is doing to address flooding. And before we move into the actions you can take as a resident, it's just important to note that overall community resilience isn't tied to any one single factor or segment in the community. Whole community resilience depends on the resilience of the government, of residents, of the environment, of businesses, and all those things kind of need to work together to have a community be resilient overall. And so tonight, for the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on residential resilience, but I think you'll see that the 10 actions we're going to discuss kind of overlap with or feed into some of these other resilience areas that are in this diagram. So way number one is really simple in theory. It's to accept change. The very first step to wanting to do something about coastal flooding, to be willing to invest time and money into efforts to help with coastal flooding, is to accept that the environment's changing and our behaviors have to change in response. And I want to be clear that I don't mean climate change necessarily by this. I just mean natural environmental changes. For example, this photo is a great example of that. This is Long Beach Island. It's the southern end of Long Beach Island looking north towards Holgate and Beach Haven. And so what you see is that this natural area is significantly further toward the mainland than the rest of the island is. And the reason for this is naturally, as storms come and waves wash over the island, sometimes you'll have sand that's being moved from the ocean side of the beach over to the bay side of the beach. And that's what you can see here happening in this natural strip of sand. And the difference is, if you look up to where the houses are, the island is not moving backwards. That's because we're holding it in place, basically, with beach nourishment and bulkheads on the bay side. And so I'm not making a value judgment on how we're managing this. It's just a good example of accepting that change is constantly happening in the natural environment. Nature wants to do one thing, but humans may want to do something else. And so we need to accept that and be willing to take action and invest money to live with these natural forces. And it's also about recognizing that the impacts of coastal hazards are happening now, not at some time in the distant future, which is sometimes, I think, the way we think about things like climate change. But especially in the coastal area, we can see the changes happening around us right now. To that end, this is a graph from the Atlantic City tide gauge that began recording tidal heights in 1911 up until the present. And this is the oldest tide gauge we have in New Jersey. So it gives a good picture of change over time. It shows that over the past century, the rate of sea level rise has been about 4 millimeters per year. And that equals out to be about a 1.35 foot increase over the last 100 years. So this is how we know sea level is rising. The picture on the right is a picture of Great Bay Boulevard, where our Coastal Education Center is located, and the Marine Field Station for wreckers. And when I look at this picture, this is during an October high tide last year. The roadway is mostly flooded. You have to imagine that when they built this road, they didn't ever expect it to be underwater like this. Maybe during the worst storms, but certainly not because of a high tide. But that, it gets at that idea that it doesn't matter really why it's changing. You could argue over that all day if you wanted to, but it is. And so we need to just focus on what we can do about it. And to that end, we can look back to look ahead. Recognizing that conditions are changing can kind of give us the tendency to look back when planning for resilience. And I think it's natural for humans to look to what's happened in the past when they're preparing in the future. But in the case of sea level rise, we definitely need to look for the future in order to be prepared. To that end, Rutgers has produced a lot of great science to help people understand what sea level rise numbers really mean. This is a report that was initially compiled in 2016, and they just updated it last year with the latest science. This is one of the charts in the report. I am not a table person, I'll tell you that, but this one is actually really good if you take a little time to figure out how to look at it. Basically, you can go to your year along the top. So let's say we wanted to look at sea level rise estimates for 2050. I go to 2050, and then I go down the column, and it split the estimates from a low likelihood to a high likelihood. And basically, if I look right in the middle, what I see is that the models show that there's about a 50% chance that sea level rise will have increased about 1.4 feet from 2000 by year 2050. If I want to look out further into the future, we get into these low, moderate, high columns. And basically, the reason for that is once you go further into the future, the modeling is based on greenhouse gas emissions. And so you have to choose what we call an emissions scenario, and that will dictate the level of sea level rise associated with that year. Another way of looking at this that Rutgers lays out in that report is, what does that really mean? Okay, sea level rise by 1.4 feet. What does that actually mean? So this is a table that shows expected high tide flooding days in Atlantic City. So when we say high tide flooding days, we mean a day where it's not raining or stormy. It's just that the high tide that day is creating flood conditions. Where the water maybe comes over bulkheads or comes up through the storm drains into the streets. And so, in 2030, at that 50% likelihood, 1.4 feet, we see that it would be about 35 days a year that we'd see flooding in AC. If we move out to 2050, we're talking about 120 days each year of high tide flooding. And that's a lot. That would significantly change the way people live and work and play in that area. And it's something that we have to think about and really seriously begin to prepare for. So once we've accepted that it is indeed flooding, the next step is to start thinking about what is the actual flood risk to me. And the initial simplest way to do this is to know your FEMA flood zone. FEMA has mapped flood zones across the nation based on various levels of flood risk. And each FEMA flood zone reflects either a severity or a type of flood risk in the area. The ultimate purpose of FEMA's flood maps is to inform the regulations and premiums for the National Flood Insurance Program, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But for now, aside from insurance purposes, FEMA flood maps are a simple first step to assess the flood risk where you live. So the official website to do this is the FEMA Map Service Center, and it's that website in the top right. If you go there, you get this as the home page. This is just a screenshot of the page. And you can put your address right here in the search bar and hit search, and it'll bring you to your flood map. So I did that for the address of our Coastal Education Center, which is 130 Great Bay Boulevard in Tuckerton. And so it brought me to this flood map. Basically, these maps show different flood risk zones shaded in different colors. And what I can do once I get to my map is zoom in a little closer and see exactly what zone my property is in. So now I've zoomed in, and what this map shows is what they call special flood hazard areas in blue, which are deemed high-risk areas. And in these high-risk blue areas, there's a 1% chance of a flood in any given year. In these blue areas, they also give you what's called the base flood elevation. It's this L7 feet they have here, and that is the expected height of the flood for that 1% chance flood each year. The orange area is considered an other flood risk area. This one in particular is Zone X. You can see it right there. And this is an area where there's a 0.2% chance each year that this flood will happen. So you can see that the building I was looking for is actually just outside of the blue area in that 0.2% annual chance flood hazard area. So once you've found your flood zone, you've taken a first step for sure towards knowing your flood risk. The next step is to expand your understanding of flood risk, because there are other ways of understanding flooding beyond the FEMA maps. Flooding can come from a variety of sources. It can be caused by a variety of different events. One thing that floodplain managers like to say is that everyone lives in a flood zone. And it's estimated that over 2/3 of flood losses or flood damages actually occur outside of those mapped FEMA flood zones. FEMA flood maps also are considering current conditions, but not necessarily future conditions. So it's important to get a broader picture of your risk. So to do that, a great tool to use in New Jersey is the NJ Flood Mapper. This is a screenshot of the homepage. If you go to the website, which is njfloodmapper.org, you can see it in the bottom right corner. And once I'm to this website, to get started, I would go to the search bar up here and type in my address. Or if I wanted to just play around, I could zoom in by clicking these plus or minus symbols on the upper left side. I can also just scroll on my mouse to zoom. So I am again going to go to the search bar and I typed in my address for the Coastal Education Center. And that zoomed me right in to the building. Right here, it has a little dot on it, but I can't see the building and I would like to. So what I can do about that is go over to these options on the side here. I can click on base maps, and that gives me a list of all different types of maps that I can use to see what I'm trying to find out about. And so what I clicked on was imagery because I just wanted to see kind of the aerial image. And now I have a nice picture of the building itself. So now I'm ready to start looking at the different types of flood hazards that I might find here. If you click on the flood hazard menu over on the left, it gives you a choice of a whole bunch of different types. One thing I want to point out is that the FEMA flood zones are in on this map. You could just add them here and you'd see that same blue and orange mapping that we looked at on the FEMA website. It's the same data, but this is not the official source for that data, so I wanted to show you FEMA first. So what I did next is I clicked on SLOSH Category 2, which is a storm surge estimate for a Category 2 hurricane. You can see here we have Category 1 through Category 4. These are all different storm surge models for hurricanes. So I took a look at Category 2, and I get this map that shows me the level of inundation estimated for Category 2 hurricane. I can see that my building is in the 0 to 3 feet potential flooding area. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to try another flood hazard. This time, maybe I'll take a look at sea level rise. That's the second choice here. And the way I add this one is I pick my level of sea level rise. I would click this drop down right here. I'm going to choose 2 feet. We said that there's about a 50% chance of 1.4 feet by 2050. So why don't I round up and I'll go with 2. I click add, and that puts sea level rise onto the map. In addition to sea level rise, I've also added the Sandy storm surge extent on this map. I think that is a good way to look at it because you can actually get an idea of what sea level rise would look like in terms of something that's actually already happened. The dark blue areas are the Sandy storm surge extent, and the lighter blue areas are my 2 feet of sea level rise. And so you can actually see that my building here is still dry, although it looks like during Sandy, the water came right up into the backyard. There's one other tool that I want to show you on the flood mapper, and that's this total water levels tool. It's the top thing on this list of options over here. This is a great tool that you can actually walk through and choose a bunch of different factors to kind of make your own model. You choose your tide gauge, you choose your greenhouse gas emissions scenario, you choose a year that you're trying to think about to plan out to. You can choose your own sea level rise estimate, and then you can add a flood event on top of that. And so the value added here is that you can cumulatively look at sea level rise and high tide and storm surge. The most devastating flooding that New Jersey has seen has usually been because it was a combination of a storm surge on top of a high tide. This is true for Sandy. It's what happened in the 1962 Ash Wednesday storm. And so we know that flooding doesn't usually occur just because of one factor. Often there are cumulative factors, and that's what this tool allows you to do. So I went through, I chose my different options here, and I ended up with a 6 feet of total water level, which you now see depicted on the map. One more thing you can do with Flood Mapper is add some facilities of interest around your town. Just because your house isn't flooded doesn't mean that flooding won't impact you. If you can't get to the grocery store or if emergency services can't get to you, that can be just as much of a problem as your house getting wet. So there's a bunch of different layers you can select from and add to the map to actually get an idea of how flooding will impact more than just your house, but also your community. I went ahead and picked evacuation shelters. Those are these little yellow dots. I also put in the schools, which is this right here, fire stations, and my hurricane evacuation routes, which are in purple. So I encourage you to go in and try out Flood Mapper. It has a lot of different things you can look at. and can really help you get an idea of your true flood risk. So once you know your flood risk, you might want to consider flood insurance. Even a little bit of water can be really, really damaging. And FEMA likes to say where it rains, it floods. So just because you don't live in a flood zone doesn't mean that it can't flood at your house. The good thing is if you don't live in a mapped FEMA flood zone, it's much, much cheaper to get flood insurance, and you can get it for a really low rate. That can just be a nice safety blanket because most homeowners insurance does not cover this type of flooding. So if you're interested in getting flood insurance, you could either get a private policy, you can do it through the National Flood Insurance Program, or you could get a combination of both. This is a map of cumulative flood insurance claims from the National Flood Insurance Program. You can see that we in New Jersey are in the deep dark blue section. We've had a lot of flood damage over the years. This is since 1970. The National Flood Insurance Program was established in 1968. It's administered by FEMA, hence why they have all that mapping to determine their premiums. So if you go to look at flood insurance, there will be a few different things impacting what a policy would cost for you. It depends on your flood risk and the amount of coverage that you're getting. It also depends on how well adapted your house is to flooding, for lack of a better way of saying it. If you live in that high-risk flood area, but your home is below the base flood elevation, you pay quite a bit more than you would if it was elevated. And that's just because by being raised above the potential flood level, there's way less chance of you having flood damage or even a total loss of your home. So if you want to look further into flood insurance, the official site is, for the National Flood Insurance Program at least, is floodsmart.gov. That's a good place to start. There are also private policies you can get, but on floodsmart.gov, they have a list of insurance providers for your state. I just picked New Jersey, and it gave me a whole bunch of different options to choose from. You can also call your homeowner's insurance group and see if they offer flood insurance as well. So once you've thought about flood insurance, the next step is to prepare yourself. You need to have a plan to know what you're going to do, where you're going to go, and what you need to be ready if there's a flood. A first easy step is to sign up for emergency alerts through your phone. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. IPAWS stands for the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System. This is that alert that usually is just automatically sent to your cell phone if there's an Amber Alert or a tornado warning, and everybody gets it. So make sure those are turned on your phone. You can also get alerts through the Nixle app, which it isn't really an app. You actually just text your zip code to this number, and then you start receiving alerts. This I use because it gives you local alerts from your local police department. So if a roadway is flooded, but it's not necessarily a state level emergency, it's still good to know if it's going to affect you and your local community. You can also use the FEMA app for alerts. A nice thing about the FEMA app is besides just these emergency alerts, there's information on how to prepare, how to make an emergency kit, even things you can do to prepare your house. To further be prepared, besides just getting alerts, you're going to want to know your coastal evacuation route. Plan to get gas. We all have seen the long lines that can happen after a storm, and either there's no gas or the power outages are cutting off the supply chain, or there's lines a mile long. And obviously you're much better off if you have gas before the storm comes. Finally, you want to make an emergency kit. I think we all remember all too well those days of early COVID when there was no food left in the grocery store. I know I went to get some canned goods, and I think there was like really gross things like canned prunes was probably the only thing they had left, something terrible like that. And so it's better to have that stash before it's an emergency situation. Once you've prepared yourself, there's a bunch of steps you can take to prepare your home. These range from very easy things like taking photos or videos of your valuable possessions so you have documentation for insurance, storing your valuables at higher elevation, so don't have important things in the basement where they're going to be the first thing to get wet. Just cleaning debris from your gutters and your storm drains can make a huge difference. There can easily be a flood because of a blocked storm drain that could have been avoided if someone had just gone out and swept away the branches or whatever it is that's blocking it. Moving into a little more complex things, you can elevate your electrical and mechanical equipment. If you have washer, dryer, furnace, etc. in the basement, you can put them up on masonry blocks. Outside, you can raise your air conditioning above the flood level. And then we move into more complex things like these structural solutions. And obviously I'm moving very quickly through very complex things, but I just kind of want to give you a taste of the different things that can be done. Sometimes people put flood vents in their foundation walls to just allow the water to pass through without damaging the foundation or sweeping the house away. And I've never seen this in real life, but you can also put in small flood walls that actually hold the water back. Another interesting thing is this backflow valve you see at the bottom right. This can be really important to get installed to keep the sanitary sewer from backing up into your house if there's a major flood issue. And finally, we're all pretty familiar with raising homes. We've all seen that done. And it is even also a possibility to move your house, although I don't think people generally do this unless it's a historic structure that can't be raised or otherwise altered to protect it from flooding. Number 7 is follow building regulations. The state has very stringent development regulations for flood zones that are designed to minimize damage to your home and also make sure that what someone does on their property doesn't cause flooding problems for their neighbors. The New Jersey flooding rules regulate activities in the FEMA 100-year flood zone, but those special flood hazard areas, that's the area in blue. And there are a lot of things that are regulated under this rules, grading and filling, things like that, adding impervious surface. And there's also rules about enclosures. So a lot of times with these bottom floors of houses, if they're in this flood zone, they are supposed to be used only as a garage, but after construction, folks will, add a bedroom and add a bathroom, and now they have a kitchen down there, and no one knows it's down there. It's already passed inspection, but if there's a flood and the water comes through that area, there's going to be a lot worse damage than there would have been if none of that stuff was there. Number 8 is let the rain sink in. This is about impervious surfaces. So impervious surfaces are, pavements, sidewalks, driveways, surfaces that don't let the rain pass through. And when the rain can't pass through, it has to run off to another area, and flooding is increased. This is a map from Rowan University that shows an increase in impervious surface between 1986 and 2015 in Stafford. And you see there's been a tremendous increase, and this is not an unusual trend to see throughout New Jersey. One thing to do about this is to make your own yard more flood friendly. We call it the Jersey Friendly Yard Program. It's things like planting native plants, creating a rain garden, and using surfaces for your driveway or deck that allow the rain to sink through. Here's some pictures of the type of permeable surfaces, which means the water can go right through, that you could choose from. Some of them can be really much more pretty than your typical concrete.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to open up the polling.
Okay.
So everyone should be able to answer those poll questions. There's a time limit. There's about 20 minutes, I think I set it for. And then when you are done with it, be sure to hit the submit button so we get your responses.
Awesome. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
And I just have about 5 minutes more. I know I'm going a little over. I'm sorry. Number 9 is to be a good number. This be a good neighbor, not a good number, a good neighbor. This one doesn't come along with any, fancy tools or websites. It's just the idea that there are people in your community for whom preparing for flooding is not as easy as just running to the grocery store and stocking up on canned goods, or making changes in their yard because they physically can't do it, or maybe they don't have the money to do it. There's all different reasons why some people are more vulnerable. And by being a good neighbor, you're helping them, and you're also helping your community overall to be more resilient. And the last one is to actually get involved. Involvement can take all different forms. One thing you can do is volunteer with groups that do projects to protect and restore the natural areas that offer flood protection. Things like planting dune grass or building oyster reefs. That's what they're doing up here in the top right corner. These are actually projects you can get involved in creating as just a regular person. And it's fun, and it makes you feel good, and you're helping the environment, and you're actually improving flood resilience in the community as well. And finally, this is what I mentioned earlier about the question about development behind the dune. New Jersey is making efforts to change and update their regulations to incorporate climate change and sea level rise considerations. It's called New Jersey Pact, Protecting Against Climate Threats. If you go to the DEP's main climate change webpage, which is down here in the right, you'll find links to everything they're doing, which includes this New Jersey Pact. There's opportunities for submitting your own ideas. And then also you can sign up for the Climate Resilience Listserv to get updates about when there are opportunities to get involved. And that way you just are aware of what's going on around the state. And that wraps it up. So I guess if there's, I know we're at time, but I'm happy to answer more questions if you want.
Hi, yeah, there were a few more questions.
Okay.
So we can try to address some of those. Mostly they go back to some of these large, kind of the large issues. Here's one. So in general, well, New Jersey's a home rule state, and so many of the actions that try to address these kind of coastal flooding problems are implemented at a local level. What can be done for a more regional approach to protect communities? Are there any examples or models for this?
There are. So, it's true. It's recognized that it's really, at that local level where the action needs to be taken. The state can't, because of home rule, the state can't tell the local governments they have to do anything. And there are major constraints at the same time to doing things at the local level, whether it's funding capacity or just technical capacity. You don't have the folks on staff to plan for this sort of thing. But the state has recognized that and done some pilot projects. They did the FRAMES project. I forget what it is an acronym for, but that was up in central Jersey. And it was a regional approach where several municipalities were involved, identifying actions that would help all of them. Obviously, flooding does not, respect political boundaries. The state also is launching a new regional initiative called Resilient NJ. If you go to this webpage, you can also find more information about that. And this is the Resilient NJ project. Again, is a regional approach where groups of municipalities applied to participate in this program, and they had to be working together as a region. And I can't remember, they awarded this program to about 4 different groups. I know one of them is LBI, one of them is, I think, Ventnor and Margate, and then there's a couple others further north, but I don't recall exactly which towns. But yeah, it's definitely recognized that the regional approach is best. It's just a matter of, empowering the local level folks to be able to carry out this type of action. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . .
Okay. Going back to bulkheads and living shorelines.
Okay.
So there's some other questions and comments about bulkheads do fail and other engineered structures do fail, um, either due to storm surge or undercutting. Um, and the idea of a living shoreline is to um, absorb some of the energy of the storm and of the waves. Um, so can you say anything about those differences? Is a living shoreline better in that sense? Are they longer lasting, less maintenance, more maintenance?
Um, yeah. So obviously, I'm I'm not an engineer or a living shoreline expert. So I'm very much a generalist. But yes, that's absolutely correct. Bulkheads do fail, and there have been studies to show um, after Sandy that natural infrastructure, so things like areas of marsh and living shorelines, actually fared significantly better than a lot of bulkheads. So that's correct. Living shorelines absorb wave energy. Living shorelines are, in theory, more resilient. The idea of a living shoreline failing, the plants grow back with time, you would hope. Whereas if a bulkhead fails, you have to come in with heavy machinery and fix it. Living shorelines do require upkeep, especially when they're first getting established in the first few years, to make sure the plants are taking hold and it's functioning as it should.
Okay, thanks. There's also been some questions, sort of a larger policy question, which is if we do have shorelines and beaches that naturally move, um, and even with putting in dunes, those are also uh, can move themselves. Um, should we be allowed to have houses so close to the shore, or even behind dunes? Um, I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on that.
I mean, who am I to say? who are any of us to say what should or shouldn't be allowed? On a personal level, do I think that development in vulnerable areas is wise? No, it definitely isn't. It doesn't seem like it is. But I used to be, when I first entered this field, I was a lot more outspoken and vocal about, we need more regulations, and, it was very black and white for me. But what I've learned over time is you have to see both sides of the issue, because it doesn't matter if I personally feel that there shouldn't be a house there. Someone else personally feels that there should be a house there. Um, and it's really a matter of working together to find the middle ground. So, again, as far as regulations are concerned, the best thing you can do as a person, if you want to change regulations, is get involved and let the state at least know what you want and what you want to see happen. Because again, we can be as worked up about something as we want, but the rules say one thing, and that's what folks are going to follow.
Okay, there was a comment about flood insurance. Just to to summarize it, that on the FEMA maps, there's different levels of flood zones, and so not in all places are you required to have flood insurance, but it still may be a good idea, as you mentioned. So this person had noted that they're not required to have flood insurance, um, but seeing that they do have a high water table because they're fairly close to a bay, they do have flood insurance. They said it's not all that expensive, but also doesn't cover very much. Basically, just major structural damage to the foundation or structure, but not the house contents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it does make them feel better that they do have some of that protection. And then there is a final question that's still part of the insurance comment.
Okay.
I'll read you what it says. I have heard that those who have a FEMA flood policy will be listened to if a major flood occurs again, like Hurricane Sandy. Is this true or not?
Will be listened to is what it says.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly what they mean by listen to. And I'm not an expert on this, but by having flood insurance, you have more opportunities to get disaster assistance open to you. And that's really as much as I know. If you don't have flood insurance, it's still basic, there's federal disaster money you can get, but there is not as many different funding streams as there would be for people with flood insurance policies.
Okay, thanks. So I did put in the chat, I've put in a few links as we've gone along. So if people want to pop in there, if there's any of the websites you're interested in visiting, I tried to make it a little easier by putting those in the chat. There's just a few people who are still working on the polling questions. So if you are working on the polling questions, remember to hit submit when you're done, so it gives us your answers and we'll list you as being finished. So I guess maybe if I can make a final comment or question here. So I live over on the Delaware Bay side of things. So here we have a lot of, I like you had mentioned the term funding constraints. So we have a lot of funding constraints around here. We have smaller, less populated towns. We're definitely experiencing, a lot of places are experiencing problems with the bay coming up. I mean, there's certainly plenty of roads around that get water on them. Sometimes they're impassable. In a lot of places, there's dikes or some kind of dike or bulkhead that would be required to be raised. And we've had some at least where I live, we have had some studies done. Some universities actually were interested in taking a look at things. And so in some cases, to raise things kind of to a minimum level, it's a few $1 million, let's say. Some of the studies came up with, and it's interesting because they say, oh, it's relatively inexpensive. It'll just be, $8 million or $10 million. But for a lot of the communities here, even on the county level, that's just like a impossible sum to get. So I guess I don't necessarily have a question there, but I did want to make that comment. Unless you want to comment on anything, any thoughts you have about the Delaware Bayshore as opposed to the Atlantic side.
Well, you hit the nail, right on the head, which is that the way cost benefit I was talking about is calculated, places with less dense development sometimes have trouble meeting federal requirements for the cost benefit analysis because the structural value just isn't there because there aren't as many houses to be damaged. And that's really a catch-22. And, for lack of a better word, you could say it's not fair to folks who are living in these places. I'm relatively new to this career, but I feel like in the past few years, more than 10 years ago when I first started, I hear people talking about there being a problem with that system. And I've heard people at the federal level talking about figuring out how to fix that system. And I think that's really a first step. Without the federal assistance, even those towns on the Atlantic Ocean would have a heck of a hard time paying for the projects they need. We're talking multi-million-dollar projects. So we need federal help to do major flood adaptation projects. And it does seem like the feds are starting to account for some of the environmental and social benefits that you weren't seeing before through their way of doing a benefit cost analysis.
Okay, well, that's encouraging.
I don't know what kind of time frames we're talking about when we're talking about the government. You never know, but it is a little encouraging.
Okay, so I think that about wraps up all the questions. I'd like to thank you for speaking with us tonight, and I'd like to thank all those who attended for their attention and participation.
Thanks. It was my pleasure to be here.
Great job, Vanessa.
Thanks, Amy.
I saw you use my permeable pavement graphic. I got all excited.
Yeah, that's nice.
And we do Jersey-friendly yards too, so
Yeah,
thank you for that.
Very nice. Thanks for giving us credit.
Yep.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Sal, I think you're still recording, just an FYI.
I am.
Okay.